This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you may have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 18th of May 2021, and I am 2J.
I'm JM.
And I am Miss K. Again, in case you missed today's headlines, here they are. Daily Nation, court throws power plan into a spin. Standard, why Uhuru's allies are cautious on BBI. And The Star, Uhuru and Raila troops mull plan B to salvage BBI.
What a mouthful.
It is a mouthful,
Right.
and all those headlines are particularly boring. But before we get there, I'd like us to discuss a little bit about the true custodian of the Constitution and
Yes.
Victorian conditions.
That's right, that's right. So today I would like to talk about three things Professor Muzahi Nguni mentioned on last week's Damaging Ignorance. Victorian conditions, the doctrine of civil necessity, and the military being the custodian of the Constitution. Now, according to the political scientist Samuel Huntington, in a Praetorian system, the social forces confront each other nakedly. The political institutions are weakened as a result of being bastardized. For example, as the judiciary here in Kenya has been doing to the Uhuru administration, or more specifically to the executive over the last 8 years. Or because of political decay, as we see in banana republics.
Yeah.
And by the way, on a side note, the judiciary's attacks on Uhuru Kenyatta are a case of misplaced aggression. I think they are still meting out vengeance on Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi's government. And they need to get over that hangover of constantly fixing the executive.
So true.
So back to the Praetorian conditions. To put it in layman's terms, a country experiences these Praetorian conditions when the political institutions are fragile, when there is chronic political disagreement and instability amongst the institutions, when all the institutions are made to be illegitimate. And that is the intention of the judiciary. Since 2013, when Uhuru entered office, they have at every turn attempted to bastardize and systemically weaken not Uhuru Kenyatta, but weaken the executive.
Yeah.
Again, let me say this. The war is not with Uhuru. The war is with the executive. And their end goal, as former Chief Justice Moraga told us last week, is to collapse the existing order and institute rulership by judges.
Terrifying.
Well, former CJ, you would do well to remember that the custodian of the Constitution is not the judiciary, it is the military. And that is because when as a country we degenerate into political disorder as civilians, as the judiciary are driving us towards, the only institution with the ability and with the legitimacy to call us back to order is the institution with a monopoly over the instruments of violence, and that is the army. They invoke what are known as emergency powers. Emergency powers refer to the temporary suspension of normal rules in an organized political system. And then in that whole shebang, the military takes over to respond to extraordinarily dangerous circumstances that are usually a threat to public safety and to the republic.
Oh, wow. And again, just like yesterday, I want to confine myself to only one issue. And I want to tackle the use of the basic structure doctrine by the high courts. And this was actually borrowed from India and was referenced by the High Court to justify why some parts of our constitution cannot be changed. And here at the Fort Hall School of Government, we are of the opinion that this is problematic. So we'll just go through Constitutions 101. And we often talk about constitutional rigidity and constitutional flexibility. So a constitution is said to be rigid when it is difficult to amend or change. And it is said to be flexible when it is more easily amendable. And to be clear, there is no right or wrong in this case. The advantages of a rigid constitution means our legal landscape is stable and reliable. There is consistency in how our constitution is enforced. But flexible constitutions, on the other hand, allow the constitution and the government to act and react more easily as times change. They prevent future generations from being bound by past commitments when it no longer serves the common good. With that said, it becomes clear that access to amendments become the way to gauge how flexible or rigid a constitution is. Now, one way in which a constitution maker balances stability and flexibility is by designing different amendment processes for different provisions. For example, the threshold to make an amendment about the definition of privacy, for example, is quite low. This can be executed by Parliament. But Article 255 of the Constitution outlines those amendments which must go to the people before they are approved. Here, the threshold is high. Now, this balance separates constitutional issues so that the majority of ordinary provisions require a simple amendment procedure, whilst a minority necessitate a different, more difficult procedure. So now that we have the basics out of the way, I want to turn my attention to where the High Court decision falls on the spectrum. By invoking the basic structure doctrine, the court simply said that some parts of the Constitution are considered unamendable. In other words, their amendment would be prohibited. Now, this is where problems begin. If Article 1 of the Constitution states that all sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya, how can a simple panel of 5 judges declare that the people are denied the right to amend that very constitution that governs them? A rigid constitution does not prevent change. It merely makes the stakes higher to ensure the largest pool of the public approve its change. The 5 million signatures in favor of BBI represent 1/4, 25% of Kenya's entire voter registrar. A panel of 5 judges have given themselves the right to make null and void the desires of 1 out of 4 voters. Now, that is food for thought. I think the public really need to consider.
And I do agree with you, especially bearing in mind that the judges themselves are not directly selected by the people. There is no suffrage. I did not go and vote for any of those judges.
Exactly.
And yet they're having such power. I say this as a lawyer. Now, I'd like to go back to today's headlines, and they're still talking about the High Court decision on the BBI and its potential political and legal fallout. I've not sat on this panel since that decision was rendered. Therefore, for this week, kindly allow me to throw in my 2 cents, and there will be many, maybe 10 cents. Today, I'll begin with the illusion that is judicial impartiality. Judicial impartiality is the claim that judges are impartial and that the cases in a court of law are judged only based on their objective merits. I'll begin with a Kenyan proverb, and this is a Kenyan proverb that says that the law is very clear. But in the wise words of the American judge, teacher, and jurist Jerome Frank, the law is far from clear, exact, and certain. But instead, it is now and will continue to be largely vague and variable. In fact, the law may vary with the personality of the judge who happens to pass upon any given case. And research and long-standing empirical observations show that judges' personal backgrounds, their professional experience, their life experiences, their party loyalties, and their ideological leanings impact their decision-making. So what does this mean? On one hand, it means that the law is complex and courts will sometimes have to deal with difficult questions that will not have any objectively correct answers, such as the one they're dealing with today. And that is why the law allows for majority decisions. It has its own fail-safe mechanisms for what to do when we all can't agree on something. On the other hand, it means that all judges are biased. They are limited human observers confined by the boundaries of human cognition. They are prone to cognitive fallacies and biases that affect their judicial decisions.
Especially our judges.
Especially our judges. And that's the problem, because unfortunately our judiciary thinks that it is impartial and the public believes it. And that's the tragedy, because the judges in our courts know enough about the law to think that they are right, but they don't know enough about their own biases to know they could be wrong. And this information deficit, this gap between what our judges think they know and what they don't know, this gap, in my view, is the problem with the High Court decision on BBI.
Oh, that
Absolutely. You know what it reminds
couldn't agree more.
Reminds me of a silly joke.
Oh boy.
Silly joke.
Regular.
Do you know what justice is?
No.
What?
Justice is what the judge ate for breakfast.
I was actually thinking the exact same thing. You know, when they talk about all those biases, a decision could be what a judge had for breakfast, what he had for lunch, whether he was irritated by his wife before he sat down, all those small little things.
All those things play into...
They play into the major decision. So we have a 3-part criteria that we use to judge the headlines for you. We ask ourselves 3 questions. Is the headline topical or speculative, repetitive or groundbreaking, and thoughtful, or just plain lazy? I would say they're not thoughtful. They're just plain lazy. And
I think the problem is nobody is advancing the conversation.
Exactly.
I think they're all stuck in a rut based on, I don't know, I guess shock and fear.
I think it's shock and fear, and until they get out of that hole that they have stuck themselves in like a proverbial ostrich, I will toss the headline.
Yes, agreed.
And now on to our final thought. But before we get there, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And now our final thought. Today is inspired by a book entitled The First Industrial Revolution by Phyllis Dean. So this week we're going to be looking at the 4 industrial revolutions, and of course today we must start with the first. So it has been said that the Industrial Revolution was the most profound revolution in human history because of its sweeping impact on people's daily lives. Everything changed during this first industrial revolution, which began around 1750. People found an extra source of energy with an incredible capacity for work, and that source was fossil fuels. So we have coal, oil, and natural gas, though we know that coal led the way.
Yeah.
So the story of the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain. By the early 18th century, people there had used up most of their trees for building houses, building ships, for cooking, and for heating. And so in their search for something else to burn, they turned to the hunks of black stone, coal, that they found near the surface of the earth. And soon they were digging deeper to mine it. And so this acceleration process of technical innovation brought about an array of new tools and machines. It also involved more practical improvements in various fields affecting labor, production, and resource use. And so this first industrial revolution was a shift away from the agrarian economy to a manufacturing economy, where products were no longer made solely by hand, but by machines. And this led to increased production and efficiency, lower prices, more goods, improved wages, and migration from rural areas to urban areas. So arguably, the factory systems developed during the Industrial Revolution are actually responsible for the creation of capitalism, that's arguably, and the modern cities that we see today. But Britain wasn't the only place that had these deposits of coal. So I guess one of the questions I found and looked into was why the Industrial Revolution didn't begin in China or somewhere else that boasted this same natural resource. And like I said before, deforestation in England had led to a shortage of wood for lumber and fuel that started in the 16th century. But then, at the same time, while Great Britain started this Industrial Revolution, they couldn't keep their technology a secret forever. And they couldn't stop the spread of this movement. And so being very aware of this head start they had, the British government actually forbade the export of machinery, skilled workers, and manufacturing techniques. And the British monopoly couldn't last forever, especially since some Britons saw profitable industry opportunities abroad, while continental European businessmen sought to lure this British know-how into their countries. So I think that's, this is a very contextual introduction into what happened.
Let me expound on that.
Let
me tell you about the revolution before the revolution. How did the rich countries become rich? Here's a short history of the period before British industrialization. It did not happen through free trade, but through protectionism, through subsidies, through distribution of monopoly rights, through government-sponsored industrial espionage, and many other techniques, as you've mentioned. 2J, the Tudor monarchs, beginning with Henry VII, his son Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I, used these and other such interventionist tools to give Britain a head start in industry, which enabled them to get first movers advantage in this game of industrialization. In other words, the foundations of British industrialization were laid between the periods 1485 to the year 1603, some 118 years of these guys. So it all began with England's woolen manufacturing industry, which at the time was Europe's high-tech industry, right? Until Tudor times, Britain had been a relatively backward economy, relying on exports of raw wool to finance imports. The woolen manufacturing industry at the time was centered in what were known as the Low Countries. Today those countries are Belgium and the Netherlands. So Britain exported its raw wool and made a reasonable profit from it. But these foreigners in the Low Countries who knew how to convert the wool into clothes were generating much greater profits, value addition. So what did Henry VII do? He sent royal missions to identify locations suited to woolen manufacturing. He poached these skilled workers from the Low Countries, as you mentioned, Tujay. He also increased the tax on the export of raw wool and even temporarily banned its export out of Britain in order to encourage further processing of the raw material at home within Britain. In the year 1489, he also banned the export of unfinished cloth, once again to do the same thing. When his son Henry VIII took over, the one who killed his wives, he continued the policy and banned the export of unfinished cloth as well. And this was done so that British producers could simply catch up with the sophisticated competitors in Belgium and the Netherlands. The effect of the export ban was to drive competing manufacturers in those countries who were now deprived of their raw materials into ruin. And the truth of this is this, ladies and gentlemen, without the policies put in place by the Tudors and further pursued by those successors, it would have been very difficult, it would have been impossible nearly for Britain to have transformed itself from a raw material exporter into the European center of the then high-tech industry. And woolen manufacturing became its most important export industry, and it provided most of the export earnings to finance that massive import of raw materials and food that fed the Industrial Revolution now in the 1700s. And ladies and gentlemen, this all of this is true. It's all in the book, A Plan of the English Commerce, being a complete prospect of the trade of this nation, as well as the home trade, as the foreign trade as well. And this is written by Daniel Defoe, published in the year 1728. And that book shatters the foundation, myth of capitalism, that Britain succeeded because it figured out the path to true prosperity before other countries through free trade and free market and all of that.
So are we saying that Kenya needs to do the same thing, maybe with coffee or with tea?
Exactly.
No raw coffee, no raw tea can leave the country unless it has a value add. Yeah.
Here's another quote. This what you've spot, Tujay. Be smart, be faster, or cheat.
Wow.
And you know what? I don't mind any of that.
You don't mind option 3 specifically because we cannot be faster. Already time has passed. And I'd like to talk about the myth that GM has just shattered and speak a little about the effect of an industrial revolution. According to the author of today's book, there are 3 main ways in which an economy which has experienced an industrial revolution differs from one that has not. One, and it has the first change is in its industrial and social structure. The second is in productivity and in the standards of living associated with higher productivity. And the third is in its rates of economic growth. On the changes in the industrial and social structure, the first change is that more of the working population become engaged in manufacturing or in the manufacturing industry as opposed to agriculture. We know that an pre-industrial economy, most of the population, perhaps 80%, is involved in agriculture. And as you go towards industrialization, more of the population, leaving about 25% or 25 to 15%, remain in agriculture. The second change is that the population grows exponentially, and because they're not farming for subsistence anymore, they need more jobs in the manufacturing industry. And because the people are many, they crowd into the urban areas where these jobs can be found. So in the 1700s in England, the proportion of the population living in towns or cities was not more than 16%. But by 1841, the proportion of people living in cities was about 60%. Wow. And the high rate at which people moved into towns and cities created many social problems, such as a widening of the gulf between the rich and the poor. It made human labor dirt cheap because it was so much, and it created squalid living environments for many people. And because many of these city migrants were composed of uprooted people, the towns became a breeding ground for vice and crime. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound like Nairobi at some point? But on the positive side, Production per head in Britain at the same time was estimated to have multiplied nearly 2 times. And this brought with it more than doubling of the national living standard.
Yeah.
So compared with their contemporaries in other countries, the British people enjoyed a richer and far more varied standard of living as a result of their industrialization. So the net result of an increasing population, a shift from agriculture to manufacturing, and a rise in production per head is economic growth. And there are 3 main factors on which the rate of economic growth of an economy depends. That is the rate of growth, or the rate of growth of an improvement of the labor force, the rate of capital accumulation, and the rate of technological change. And while Britain's growth was not a speedy or uniform process, it was continuous. And that for me is a lesson for Kenya. Our own growth, which in some instances I feel mirrors that growth. We have growing population, we are growing in production, and we are changing in our standard of living. It may not be speedy, and we may have periods in which we climb and we fall, but our progress has been continually upward, especially with this administration. And what I think we need as a country is to tone down our pessimism and have a heavy dose of patience, because we will industrialize. We are industrializing.
So true.
Yeah.
I don't know if Kenyans will listen. I think they enjoy being pessimistic.
I think they should stop, and they should look back at history and realize that we are on that process, and it's never straightforward, but we are on it. And as long as we are on it and we continue to grow continually upward, we will continue to industrialize. So be patient.
Absolutely.
Be patient with the Uhuru administration. We're getting there. So today we did not have a winning headline. We did not even address the cartoons because they weren't worth our time or energy.
They weren't.
And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can find us on our TV screens. We are on Pan, Free to Air, GoTV, and Star Times. I'll end on a quote from a Supreme Court judge, Olive Wendell Holmes Jr., and he says, "The young man knows the rules, but the old man knows the exceptions." I think that's a food for thought. You have a good evening.